In 1964, a room full of Hollywood's toughest stopped talking. Steve McQueen had just made a joke. Bruce Lee didn't smile. What happened in the next 9 seconds didn't look like much. But three men who were there said the same thing years later. I never saw Steve look at anyone that way again. This is what they remembered. Los Angeles, 1964. Bel Air. If you didn't know where to look, you'd miss it entirely. Bruce Lee's school had no storefront, no advertisements, no walk-ins. You were invited or you weren't. He called it Jun Fan Gung Fu. Others would later call it Jeet Kune Do. But in 1964 it had no name. The public knew. It was simply his method. The backyard was small. A wooden fence surrounded it. There were no mirrors, no posters, no trophies on display. Just open space, a heavy bag, and whoever Bruce had chosen to teach that day. The students weren't beginners off the street. They were black belts from other systems, stuntmen who'd been in real fights, actors who wanted more than choreography, men who already knew how to move, coming to learn how to move better. They didn't pay in the traditional sense. Bruce didn't charge by the hour. Some brought skills. Some brought connections. Some simply brought respect and the willingness to unlearn everything they thought they knew. This wasn't a dojo. It was a laboratory. Bruce taught in private because what he was developing didn't fit into the traditions people expected. He stripped techniques down to their essence. If a movement didn't work in a real confrontation, he discarded it. If it required too much setup, he simplified it. Speed, directness, efficiency. No wasted motion. No performance. The men who trained there described it the same way years later. Quiet, focused, intimate. Bruce would demonstrate a concept once, maybe twice. Then he'd let you feel it. Not watch it. Feel it. And once you felt the difference between the traditional block and his intercept, between a chambered punch and his straight lead, you understood why he didn't need to convince anyone with words. Words spread slowly, deliberately. A stuntman would mention it to another stuntman. A martial artist from one school would quietly show up at another's gym moving differently. And eventually the question would come, "Where did you learn that?" The answer was always the same name. By late 1964, Bruce Lee's backyard had become something Hollywood didn't quite have a word for yet. Not a gym, not a studio, a place where reputation was measured in silence, where ego was left at the gate, and where some of the most physically capable men in the industry came to realize how much they still had to learn. It was into this space, on an afternoon no one recorded on any official calendar, that Steve McQueen walked in. Steve McQueen didn't need an introduction. By 1964, he was already one of the biggest names in Hollywood. The Great Escape had made him a star. The camera loved him. Audiences loved him more. He had that rare thing, the kind of presence you couldn't teach or fake. He walked into a room, and the room noticed. But McQueen wasn't just an actor playing tough. He'd grown up hard. Reform school, street fights, the Marines. He knew what real danger looked like, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He rode motorcycles fast. He raced cars faster. And he'd trained in martial arts before. Legitimate training, not the Hollywood kind. He respected skill. But he also had confidence that came from being good at nearly everything he tried. When he arrived at Bruce's backyard that afternoon, he came at someone's invitation, likely a mutual friend, maybe a stuntman. The details vary depending on who tells the story. But everyone agrees on one thing. McQueen was relaxed, friendly even. He shook hands. He watched Bruce work with a few students. He asked questions. Bruce was polite. Professional. He showed McQueen some techniques, explained some concepts, the kind of introduction he'd given to dozens of visitors before. McQueen seemed impressed. He had the eye of someone who understood movement, timing, body mechanics. Then, at some point, the tone shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no insult in the traditional sense, but McQueen said something. Witnesses remember it differently. Some say it was a joke about Bruce's size. Some say it was a comment about traditional martial arts versus real fighting. Others recall it as a casual remark about whether the techniques would actually work against someone bigger, stronger, trained. The exact words don't matter. What mattered was the implication. McQueen wasn't being vicious. He was being McQueen. Confident. A little irreverent. Testing the waters the way competitive men do. It was the kind of comment that, in another setting, might have just been banter. But Bruce didn't laugh. The room noticed before McQueen did. The other students, the ones who'd been training there for months, they saw Bruce's expression change. Not anger. Not offense. Something quieter. A shift in attention, like a door closing and a different one opening. Bruce let the comment sit in the air for a moment. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, even. No edge to it. He said something along the lines of this: "If you're curious whether it works, I can show you. Not demonstrate on someone else. Show you." Directly. McQueen paused. He looked at Bruce, then he smiled, the kind of smile that says, "All right, sure, let's see it." He wasn't backing down. He wasn't worried. Why would he be? He outweighed Bruce by at least 30 pounds. He'd been in real fights. He'd trained with credible people. He expected a technique, a controlled demonstration, maybe a wrist lock, maybe a throw, something he could feel, acknowledge, and then everyone would move on. Bruce nodded. He asked McQueen to stand a certain way. No fighting stance, just natural, hands at his sides, relaxed. McQueen obliged, still smiling, still comfortable. The others stepped back, not dramatically, just enough to give space. The backyard went quiet. No one was talking anymore. No one was moving. All eyes were on the two men standing a few feet apart. Bruce positioned himself. No theatrics, no build-up, no explanation of what was about to happen. He just looked at McQueen and said, "Ready?" McQueen nodded. What happened next took 9 seconds. Bruce didn't move right away. He stood there, centered, breathing normally, looking at McQueen the way a craftsman looks at a piece of wood before the first cut. Not hostile, not eager, just focused. McQueen was still standing casually, arms loose, weight evenly distributed. He wasn't guarding himself because he didn't think he needed to. This was a demonstration, not a fight. He trusted that. He trusted Bruce wouldn't actually hurt him. And he was right. Bruce had no intention of hurting him. But he was about to teach him something. Bruce spoke quietly. He told McQueen to stay relaxed, not to tense up, not to try to block or evade. Just let the technique happen so he could feel the principle behind it. The others had heard Bruce give this instruction before. It was part of how he taught. You can't understand interception until you've been intercepted. You can't grasp centerline control until someone takes yours away. McQueen nodded again. He was listening, still calm, still curious. Bruce adjusted his own stance slightly, his lead foot forward, weight on the balls of his feet. Hands came up, not clenched, just position, one near his center line, one slightly back. It looked simple, almost too simple. No wind-up, no coiling, no telegraphing. The backyard was silent. One of the students would later say he remembered the sound of a neighbor's lawnmower in the distance. Another recalled a bird landing on the fence. Small details that stick in memory when everything else goes still. Bruce's eyes never left McQueen's. Then he said one word. Now. And he moved. Not a step, not a lunge, just a shift of weight, a rotation of the hips, and his lead hand shot forward. Straight. Direct. No arc. No chambering. It traveled maybe 18 inches total. It didn't hit McQueen's face. It didn't need to. Bruce's fist stopped 1 inch from McQueen's nose. Exactly 1 inch. But what McQueen felt wasn't the fist. It was everything that came with it. The speed, the precision, the absolute control. The fact that Bruce had closed the distance and occupied the space McQueen thought he controlled before McQueen's brain even registered movement. McQueen's head didn't snap back. He didn't flinch. He just froze. His eyes widened slightly. His jaw tightened. For a moment, maybe two, he didn't breathe. Bruce held the position. Fist still extended. Still 1 inch away. He didn't say anything. Didn't smile. Didn't gloat. He just let McQueen feel the reality of what had just happened. Then Bruce withdrew his hand. Slowly. Deliberately. He stepped back. Resumed a neutral posture. His expression didn't change. The whole thing, from the moment Bruce said now to the moment he stepped back, lasted 9 seconds. Maybe 10, but to McQueen it must have felt longer. Or maybe shorter. Time does strange things when you realize you've miscalculated. McQueen blinked. He took a breath. His hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, came up slightly, not defensively. Just there. Like his body was catching up to what his mind had just processed. He looked at Bruce, really looked at him. Not the way you look at a trainer, not the way you look at a performer. The way you look at someone who just showed you something you didn't know existed. Bruce didn't fill the silence. He didn't explain what he'd done, didn't break down the mechanics, didn't offer McQueen a chance to try again. He just waited. One of the other students shifted his weight. The sound of gravel under a shoe. It was the first noise anyone had made since Bruce moved. McQueen's smile was gone. Not replaced with anger, not embarrassment, just gone. He nodded slowly. Once. A small, controlled movement. The kind of nod that means message received. He didn't ask questions, didn't make another jolt, didn't try to deflect or minimize what had just happened. He just said quietly, "Okay." Bruce nodded back. No words, just acknowledgement. Then Bruce turned to one of the other students and continued the session as if nothing unusual had occurred. He demonstrated a different technique. Explained a concept about footwork. His tone was the same as it had been 10 minutes earlier. Calm. Instructional. Present. But McQueen didn't stay to watch. There are moments in life that redefine context. Before McQueen walked into that backyard, he had a certain understanding of martial arts. He knew it required discipline. He knew it took years to develop. He respected it the way someone respects a difficult craft they've observed, but never mastered. But respect from a distance is different than respect earned through direct experience. What Bruce showed him wasn't a technique. It was a gap. A gap between what McQueen thought was possible and what actually was. Between the speed he believed he could track and the speed that exists beyond tracking. Between control he understood intellectually and control he'd just felt in his bone. McQueen had been in fights. Real ones. He knew what it felt like to take a punch, to throw one, to move with adrenaline flooding his system. He understood violence. He understood danger. But what Bruce demonstrated wasn't violence. It was precision at a level that made violence irrelevant. 1 inch. That's how close Bruce's fist came. Not 2 inches, not 3. 1. He could have made contact, could have followed through, could have proven his point with force. But he didn't need to. The point wasn't about damage. It was about control, about showing McQueen that the distance he thought protected him, the reaction time he thought he had, the physical advantages he assumed mattered, none of it applied when someone moved the way Bruce moved, and McQueen understood it instantly. You could see it in his face, the way his expression changed. Not pain, not fear. Just recognition. The kind of recognition that comes when you realize you've been operating under a false assumption and reality just corrected you. He'd expected a demonstration. Something he could observe, analyze, maybe even replicate with practice. Instead, he got a lesson, one that didn't require explanation because the body understands things the mind takes longer to process. The other students watched McQueen's reaction more than they watched Bruce. They'd seen Bruce move like that before. They'd felt technique stopped inches from their own faces, their own throats, their own center lines. They knew what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that kind of skill. But watching someone like Steve McQueen experience it for the first time, that was different. McQueen wasn't a novice. He wasn't some actor pretending to be tough. He was legitimate. He'd earned his confidence honestly. And in 9 seconds, that confidence met something it couldn't deflect with charm or charisma or prior experience. Bruce didn't humiliate him. That wasn't the goal. Humiliation requires an audience, requires spectacle, requires someone to be diminished for others to witness. This was the opposite. It was private, contained, a teaching moment disguised as a demonstration. After McQueen said okay, after Bruce turned back to the other students, McQueen stood there for a moment. Just stood. Hands still slightly raised, breathing steady but deliberate. Processing. One of the students, years later, would describe McQueen's face in that moment as the look of a man recalibrating. Not defeated, not angry, just adjusting, updating his internal map of what was real. McQueen watched Bruce work with another student for maybe 2 more minutes. He didn't participate, didn't ask follow-up questions, just observed. His posture had changed, shoulders a little less loose, eyes a little more focused. The casual energy he'd walked in with had shifted into something quieter. Then, without ceremony, he walked over to Bruce, waited for a pause in the instruction, extended his hand. Bruce shook it. McQueen said something. The exact words, again, depend on who tells the story. Some say it was just thank you. Others remember it as appreciated or good to meet you. Short, respectful. No elaboration. Bruce nodded, said something equally brief in return. And then Steve McQueen left. No lingering. No small talk. No effort to save face or reframe what had happened. He just walked out of the backyard the same way he'd walked in. Except now, the air around him felt different. Heavier. More considered. The students watched him go. No one said anything. Bruce didn't comment. Didn't ask if anyone had questions. He just continued the session. Moved on to the next drill. The next principal. The next student. But everyone in that backyard knew what they'd just witnessed. It wasn't a fight. McQueen hadn't lost anything tangible. No scoreboard changed. No record was updated. But something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed and then quietly acknowledged. Bruce had made his point without making it a spectacle. McQueen had received the message without needing it repeated, and the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that comes after a question gets answered so completely that no one needs to discuss it further. 9 seconds. That's all it took. The session continued for another hour. Bruce taught the way he always did. Methodical. Focused. Breaking down movements into principles. Showing how structure creates power, how relaxation creates speed, how awareness creates timing. But the energy in the backyard had changed. The students trained harder, not out of fear, not out of competition, just differently, more attentive, more precise. They'd all felt Bruce's techniques before. They'd all been stopped mid-movement, repositioned, controlled. But watching it happen to Steve McQueen, someone who carried himself with that kind of natural authority, it recontextualized everything. If Bruce could do that to McQueen, someone bigger, stronger, more experienced in the world outside martial arts, then what they were learning wasn't just theory. It wasn't just Eastern philosophy adapted for Hollywood. It was something else, something that worked regardless of who you were. Bruce didn't mention the incident, didn't use it as a teaching example, didn't say, see, that's what I mean when I talk about interception. He just continued. Moved from one student to the next. Corrected posture. adjusted angles, demonstrated timing. But everyone was thinking about it. When the session ended, the students left in small groups. They talked quietly among themselves. Not loudly, not with excitement, just processing, comparing notes. What did you see? Did you catch how fast that was? Did you see Steve's face? None of them were surprised Bruce could move that way, but seeing someone from outside their circle, someone with McQueen's reputation, respond the way he did, it confirmed something they'd suspected but couldn't quite articulate until now. This wasn't a game. Over the following days, word spread. Not widely, not publicly. Just within the small network of stuntmen, martial artists, and actors who moved in overlapping circles. The story got passed along in gyms, on sets, during downtime between takes. Steve McQueen came by Bruce Lee's place. Bruce showed him something. McQueen left early. The details varied. Some versions had McQueen challenging Bruce directly. Others had it as friendly curiosity. A few added drama that wasn't there. But the core remained consistent. McQueen walked in one way, walked out another. And Bruce never brought it up. That restraint mattered. In Hollywood, where reputation was currency and stories were told and retold until they became myth, Bruce's silence said more than any boast could have. He didn't need to tell people what happened, didn't need to frame it as a victory, didn't need to use McQueen's name to build his own credibility. He just let it exist. The people who were there would tell the story if asked. But Bruce wouldn't, and that choice, that discipline, became part of his legend just as much as the technique itself. A few weeks later, someone asked Bruce about McQueen's visit. Casual question. Offhand, Bruce's response was simple. He came by. We talked. He's a good guy. That was it. No elaboration, no storytelling, no emphasis on what had happened or what it meant. Just acknowledgement that McQueen had been there and the interaction was respectful. The person asking expected more, waited for Bruce to continue. But Bruce had already moved on to something else, a concept he was developing, a training method he wanted to test. The conversation about McQueen was over before it really began. Meanwhile, McQueen didn't talk about it either. He didn't mock Bruce again, didn't make jokes, didn't downplay what happened or reframe it into a story where he came out looking better. He just stopped. People who knew McQueen noticed. He'd always been someone who spoke his mind, made observations, offered opinions. But when Bruce Lee's name came up, McQueen's responses became shorter, more measured. Someone would say something about martial arts. McQueen would nod. Someone would ask if he'd ever trained with Bruce. McQueen would say, yeah, briefly, and then redirect the conversation. It wasn't avoidance. It was respect. The kind of respect you give to someone who showed you something you didn't know, in a way you couldn't forget. Months passed, then years. Bruce's reputation grew. The backyard sessions evolved into something more structured. More students came, more actors, more fighters. The techniques Bruce developed started influencing how fight scenes were choreographed, how martial arts were portrayed on screen. And Steve McQueen's name kept coming up in certain circles, not because he told the story, but because others did. The stuntmen who were there, the students who witnessed it, they'd mention it carefully, respectfully, usually only to people they trusted. You know Steve McQueen trained with Bruce? Yeah, just once. Something happened. I wasn't there for all of it, but I heard Bruce showed him a technique. McQueen didn't stay long after that. The story became a reference point, a benchmark. If Bruce could do that to McQueen, imagine what else was possible. But Bruce still didn't use it, didn't claim it, didn't build marketing around it. He just kept teaching, kept refining, kept pushing his students to question everything and keep only what worked. That restraint, that refusal to exploit the moment, it elevated him in ways self-promotion never could, because the people who mattered, the ones who trained seriously, who understood what it meant to control someone without hurting them, to prove a point without making it personal. They saw what Bruce had done, not just in those 9 seconds, but in all the seconds after. When he chose silence over spectacle, when he let the story belong to witnesses instead of claiming it for himself, when he treated McQueen with the same respect after the demonstration as he had before it. That's what mastery looked like, not in the technique alone, but in everything surrounding it. Bruce Lee died in 1973. He was 32 years old. The world mourned. Hong Kong shut down. Thousands lined the streets for his funeral. Celebrities, students, strangers who'd only seen him on screen. They all came to pay respects. The tributes poured in from across the globe. Martial artists, actors, philosophers, people whose lives he'd touched without ever meeting them. And among those tributes, quietly, was one from Steve McQueen. McQueen didn't make a public statement, didn't give an interview, didn't write an essay about Bruce's impact or legacy. That wasn't his style. But people close to him noticed the shift in how he spoke about Bruce after the news broke. Before, when Bruce's name came up, McQueen's responses had been brief, respectful but guarded. After Bruce died, something changed. The guardedness softened. The respect deepened. A journalist asked McQueen once, sometime in the mid-70s, about martial artists he'd encountered in Hollywood. McQueen mentioned a few names, spoke about training he'd done, techniques he'd learned. Then, without prompting, he brought up Bruce Lee. He said Bruce was the real deal. Not in a way that invited follow-up questions, not in a way that suggested a story was coming, just plainly, factually, the real deal. The journalist pressed, asked what McQueen meant by that. McQueen paused, looked away for a moment, then said something like, "You had to see him move, had to feel it, otherwise you wouldn't believe it." And that was all he offered. But for those who knew the story, who'd been in that backyard or heard about it from someone who was, those few words carried weight. Because McQueen wasn't someone who gave praise lightly, he'd met everyone, worked with legends, lived a life most people only dreamed about, and out of all the fighters, all the tough guys, all the men who claimed to be dangerous, Bruce Lee was the one McQueen singled out. Not because Bruce had embarrassed him, not because there was bad blood or unfinished business, but because 9 seconds in a backyard had taught McQueen something he carried with him for the rest of his life. The students who trained with Bruce, the ones who were there that day, they told the story more openly after Bruce passed. Not to glorify violence, not to build Bruce into something he wasn't, but to preserve what actually happened. To make sure the lesson didn't get lost. One of them, a stuntman named Bob Wall, mentioned the incident in interviews years later. He didn't exaggerate, didn't add drama, just described what he saw. Bruce demonstrating a technique on McQueen. McQueen's reaction. The silence that followed. Wall spoke about it the way you speak about moments that clarify things, that show you what's possible when skill reaches a certain level. Another student, Dan Inosanto, Bruce's close friend and training partner, referenced it differently. He talked about Bruce's philosophy, about how Bruce believed martial arts wasn't about showing off, wasn't about proving you were better than someone else. It was about understanding yourself, understanding motion, understanding how to be effective without being excessive. And the McQueen story, Inosanto suggested, was a perfect example of that philosophy in action. Bruce didn't hurt McQueen. Didn't need to. He just showed him reality, let McQueen feel the gap between assumption and truth, then moved on. No gloating, no victory lap, just teaching. Over the decades, the story became part of Bruce Lee's legend. Not the biggest part, not the most famous. Bruce's films did that. His philosophy did that. His impact on martial arts and cinema did that. But the McQueen story remained, passed down through generations of students, stuntmen, martial artists. It became a parable. About what happens when ego meets skill. About what real control looks like. About the difference between winning a fight and teaching a lesson. And about the kind of restraint that defines mastery. Because Bruce could have done more, could have made contact, could have followed through and turned those 9 seconds into something McQueen felt in his body for days. But he didn't. He stopped exactly where he needed to stop, 1 inch. No further. That inch mattered more than any punch could have. It said, I don't need to hurt you to show you I could. I don't need to prove anything beyond this moment. I don't need you to submit or apologize or acknowledge me publicly. I just need you to understand. And McQueen did. Years after both men had passed, a filmmaker was researching Bruce Lee's life, interviewing people who knew him, collecting stories. He spoke with one of the students who'd been in the backyard that day. The filmmaker asked what made Bruce different from other martial artists of that era. What set him apart? The student thought for a moment, then said, Bruce understood something most people don't. He understood that the highest level of skill isn't about what you do. It's about what you don't have to do. The filmmaker asked for an example. The student told him about Steve McQueen, not as a celebrity anecdote, not as a moment of triumph, but as an illustration of principle. Bruce could have made that story into something, could have used McQueen's name to build his reputation, could have told everyone in Hollywood what happened and watched his credibility soar. But he didn't. Because the people who mattered already knew, the people who were serious about learning already understood, and the people who weren't, the ones who needed spectacle and drama and public validation, they weren't the ones Bruce was trying to reach anyway. So the story lived in whispers, in private conversations, in training halls where people spoke carefully and respectfully about what real skill looked like when no cameras were rolling. And it stayed there. Quiet, controlled, passed down not as gossip but as teaching, the way Bruce would have wanted it. Today, if you train in Jeet Kune Do, if you study Bruce Lee's philosophy, if you dig deep enough into the stories that shaped his legacy, you'll eventually hear about Steve McQueen, about a backyard in Bel Air, about 9 seconds that changed how one of Hollywood's toughest men understood what was possible. You'll hear about the fist that stopped 1 inch away, about the silence that followed, about 2 men who walked away from that moment with their respect for each other intact. And if you're paying attention, if you understand what the story is really about, you'll realize it was never about Bruce proving he was better than McQueen. It was about Bruce showing McQueen, and everyone else watching, what mastery actually means. Not dominance, not aggression, not victory, but control, precision, and the wisdom to know when stopping is more powerful than continuing. That lesson didn't die with Bruce. It lives in every student who trains with restraint, in every teacher who chooses silence over spectacle, in every moment when someone with the power to hurt chooses instead to educate. It lives in the space between what could happen and what does, in the distance of 1 inch. And in the memory of 2 men who understood, if only for 9 seconds, what it means to truly see each other.